I had always dreamed of owning a place of my own. Not just a rental or some temporary stop. Something real, something mine. So when the opportunity came up to buy a house in the heart of the capital for an unbelievably low price, I jumped at it. The place had belonged to family friends who had moved abroad 3 years ago and were desperate to sell quickly. It was a win-win. Or so I thought. From the outside, the house looked neglected. The front yard was overgrown, the walls faded, and the main entrance was secured with nothing but a rusty padlock. Not even a proper door lock. Just that one pathetic piece of metal keeping the outside world out. There wasn't even a gate. Anyone could just stroll right into the yard if they felt like it. But I wasn't intimidated. I'm a tall woman, 6 feet with broad shoulders, and I didn't plan on living alone. I had my 3 big dogs with me. Let's just say we made quite the intimidating quartet. Still, I knew the area had its quirks, and this house came with some baggage. The previous owners warned me about the neighbor. An elderly man who owned the house next door. A 3-story building he lived on the ground floor of, while renting out the top 2 floors to tenants. Apparently, he'd been bitter ever since the house had gone on the market. He'd hoped it would remain vacant or that he could somehow acquire it. But I'd swooped in and ruined that fantasy. His frustration wasn't my concern, until it was. The first red flag came the very first day I moved in. I pulled into the driveway only to find a dusty old motorbike parked in my garage. It's my garage. The boldness of it stunned me. I wheeled the bike out to the road without a second thought. That same day, I had a new metal gate installed. I wasn't about to let strangers treat my new home like a public park. Later that evening, someone banged on my gate with such rage it rattled the metal. I didn't answer, but I peeked through the curtains. There he was, gray-haired, sunburnt, pacing in front of my gate like a lion denied a meal. After about 15 minutes, he gave up and rolled the bike away. I didn't like the neighborhood. That much was clear. But I had peace for a while after that. A few locals occasionally parked in front of my gate, probably thinking the house was still abandoned, but a big "No parking" sign put an end to that quickly. Things were finally settling down, until last week. It started in the shower. The water pressure was off. Weak, sputtering, inconsistent. I frowned and twisted the knob back and forth. Nothing changed. That's when I heard it. A mechanical hum, faint but present. A pump. My neighbor's pump. Now let me explain something about how water works around here. Our city doesn't have strong enough public pressure to pump water up 3 stories. So households install their own electric water pumps to send water up to rooftop storage tanks. A ball valve in the tank detects when the level is low and triggers the pump to fill it. The neighbor had one, obviously. With 2 floors of tenants, he had to keep his supply steady. But something wasn't sitting right. My water pressure dropped every time his pump turned on. That wasn't coincidence. I tested it. Waited until his pump went silent, then turned on different taps in the house. The water gushed back to full strength. My stomach twisted. That old bastard was siphoning water from my supply. It made sense now. The previous owners had complained about weirdly high water bills, even though the house had been vacant for years. They chalked it up to pipe leaks. But not anymore. I had my culprit. Still, I had no proof. Nothing concrete. I couldn't find any direct connection. He was smart enough to hide the siphon point well, probably disguised among the old plumbing around the property's edge. But I was sure. I wrestled with what to do. Legally, I could report it. But what would that achieve? An investigation that might lead nowhere and only stir more drama? Confronting him didn't sit right either. I could already hear him denying everything with a smug grin. But deep down, I wasn't thinking like a victim. Well, I was angry. It wasn't about money. Water's dirt cheap here. My bill was barely $5 a month, even with 3 dogs, a garden, and weekly car washes. But that wasn't the point. It was the principle. He thought I wouldn't notice. That I was just some young woman, clueless and harmless. He thought he could tap into my home like it was still an abandoned lot and get away with it. No consequences. No respect. He picked the wrong woman. And I had a plan. I didn't need to call the cops. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't even need to step off my property. All I had to do was wait. I spent the next 2 days walking around my property, casually inspecting my pipes. I wasn't trying to find the siphon point anymore. I'd already accepted that he'd hidden it well. But I wanted to be ready. Ready for when I made my move. Every time I heard his water pump kick on, I'd test my taps. The pattern was undeniable. His pump started, my pressure dropped. His pump stopped, my pressure returned. Over and over. My anger simmered just beneath the surface, but I kept my face calm. I didn't want to tip him off. Not yet. I made tea, walked my dogs, smiled at the other neighbors. I even waved to him one morning while watering my plants, and he gave me this smug little nod, like he was proud of himself for pulling one over on me. That nod sealed it. I waited until Monday. It was just past 9 p.m. when I saw the lights flicker on in his house. The usual routine. Tenants coming home from work, someone cooking dinner upstairs, someone else playing music that echoed faintly through the alleyway. And then, the pump started. That familiar hum reached my ears like a war drum. Only this time I smiled. I walked calmly to the side of my house and turned off the main water valve. Just like that. One smooth motion. Felt almost too easy. Now here's the thing about our water system. As I mentioned before, the tank on the roof uses a ball valve that detects water levels. When it gets low, it sends a signal to the electric pump. But if no water is coming in, if the pipes are dry, the pump just keeps running, trying endlessly to fill a tank that will never refill. Most modern homes have fail-safes. Sensors, timers, circuit breakers. His didn't. I knew it. He lived in a building that hadn't seen upgrades since the 90s, and it showed. Tangled wires, old switches, rusted meter boxes. That pump was going to run itself to death, and the fuse box wouldn't even flinch until it all caught fire. Figuratively, of course. Hopefully. I returned to my couch, poured myself a glass of wine, and turned on a movie. Every now and then I'd mute the TV and listen. The pump was still humming. By 11 p.m. I heard some raised voices next door. By 1 a.m. I heard shouting. And by 3 a.m., chaos. I peeked through my bedroom window and saw flashlights flicking on and off inside their stairwell. One of the tenants came outside in his pajamas, pacing and cursing into his phone. A woman was shouting from an upper floor, something about the lights not working and, "There's no water either." My dogs perked up at the noise, but I calmed them down and just watched. I didn't feel guilty. Not one bit. In fact, I felt something I hadn't felt since I moved in. Peace. A little while later, the old man came stumbling out of his house in slippers and a robe, looking completely bewildered. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught a few choice words like generator, burned out, and why now? Why now indeed. By sunrise, both tenants were gone. One packed up their things and left right there and then slamming the metal gate behind them. The other shouted something about reporting him to the police and drove off in a fury. Me. I was sipping my morning coffee with the satisfaction of a queen watching justice unfold in real time. The next day, my suspicions were confirmed. He'd overloaded the wiring trying to run the pump all night. No water got through, so the pump just kept drawing power nonstop. His outdated wiring couldn't handle it and the circuit fried. Along with it, the power to half the house. Both tenants lodged complaints, official ones. In my country, access to water and electricity is considered a basic right for renters. If a landlord fails to provide it, they're in violation of tenant protection laws. Immediate fines, no court delays. The penalty? A $500 fine per complaint. And just like that, he was $1,000 in the hole. And that's not even the worst part for him. He had to refund the tenants' security deposits, which they demanded on the spot. And now, with no working pump and dead wiring, he couldn't legally rent out the upper floors until repairs were complete and certified. The costs? Far beyond his means. Turns out the tenants were his only source of income. He was a retired mechanic living on what little he made from them. And now he had nothing. Later that week, I saw his daughter helping him pack up his things. He was moving in with her temporarily, she said, because he couldn't afford to live alone anymore. He didn't look angry. He looked deflated. But then the moment I had been waiting for finally arrived. He came to my gate. It was Thursday late afternoon. The sun was low, casting golden light through the trees. I was out front trimming the hedges when I saw him shuffle up, clutching his cane like it was holding him up more emotionally than physically. "Excuse me," he said, voice scratchy like he hadn't slept in days. Did you "It happened to shut off your water on Monday night?" I blinked innocently. Oh yeah. My tank sprung a leak. Pipe cracked, flooded half my back patio. I shut off the main until my plumber could come by the next morning. Why? He stared at me for a long moment. His eyes said everything his mouth didn't. But all he said was, "Oh, okay then." And he walked away. I stood there, not saying another word, watching him disappear around the corner. Did he know I knew? Probably. Did I care? Not even a little. I got my plumber to come by that weekend and check every inch of my plumbing. We removed any exposed pipes that ran close to the property line. I even had him install a lockable cover on my external valves just in case. No more shared water. No more siphons. No more problems. In the end, all it took was one flick of a valve. And a little patience. The day he left was a strangely quiet one. His daughter showed up early in the morning, her little silver hatchback parked awkwardly across both our driveways. She didn't look happy. Her mouth was a tight, thin line, and she kept glancing at me like I was some storm cloud on the horizon. I didn't wave. I didn't even smile. I just stood in my front garden with my coffee, watching from behind my sunglasses as the old man shuffled out of his house one last time. He didn't make eye contact with me, not once. There was no angry stare, no hateful glare. He looked beaten, like someone who finally understood the cost of his entitlement. He didn't say goodbye. Good. I didn't owe him one. By mid-afternoon, the truck came to haul off what little furniture he had left. The tenants had taken everything they'd owned with them, and the upper floors stood dark and empty now, like tombs. I watched as a single sagging couch, an old wooden table, and a battered TV were loaded onto the truck like memories too bitter to keep. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. But the thing about old houses and older neighbors is, they leave ghosts behind. Not literal ones, I'm not that kind of dramatic. But the echoes of what they did, the way they made you feel small in your own space, it lingers. The house next door sat empty now, and in a strange way that made it worse. The silence was heavy. I could almost feel the resentment leaking through the concrete walls, like the building itself hadn't forgiven me for what I'd done. But I hadn't done anything wrong, right? I mean, sure, I turned off my own water. That's perfectly legal. It wasn't my fault his system was rigged to fail the second I stopped playing along. And yet there was this little voice in my head whispering, "Did you go too far?" That voice didn't last long. Because karma wasn't done yet. It was about a week after he left that a woman showed up to look at the house. I was walking my dogs when I saw her unlock the front gate and step in, clipboard in hand. Realtor, I figured. She looked professional, blouse, heels, hair tied back, and totally unimpressed by what she saw. The moment she stepped into the yard, she wrinkled her nose. The place reeked of mildew and rust. The front door hung crooked, still the same old warped wood that had probably been there since the 80s. I almost felt bad for her. Almost. A few days later, a for sale sign went up on the gate. I laughed out loud when I saw it. Because that place was a mess. No working plumbing, half the wiring fried, roof tanks probably dry rotted from neglect. He wanted to rent it, sure, but now that option was gone. Selling it would be an uphill battle. I asked around, quietly through the neighborhood grapevine. Apparently he was trying to sell it at market value. Full price. No discount. I nearly choked on my tea. No one's going to pay full price for a haunted mess with electrical issues and a bad reputation. Not in this market. A month passed. The house remained unsold. Another sign went up under the first, price reduced. And that was the cherry on top. But life didn't just go back to normal for me either. The aftermath had a strange way of creeping in. For one thing, I started noticing things I hadn't before. Like a faint rust ring around my garden tap. Or the odd spot of discolored tile behind the washing machine. Small signs. Reminders that someone had been here, using my resources, walking through my space like they owned it. Made my skin crawl. I started going over everything with a fine-toothed comb. I got the plumber to double-check all the pipes, not just the ones by the gate. I even hired a handyman to reinforce the old wall between our properties. Not because I thought the old man would come back. but because I needed to feel secure again. Claiming space is more than buying a house. It's about taking it back inch by inch from the people who tried to treat it like theirs. I never confronted him. Not once. But in some ways I won more than if I had. He didn't get to rage or threaten or gaslight his way out of this one. I didn't give him the chance. I just let reality do the talking. And reality? It hit him like a freight train. His pump was fried, his wiring melted, his tenants gone, his income dried up. The police fined him into the ground, and now he was someone else's problem. His daughter's, probably. He'll never siphon water again. Not from me. Maybe not from anyone. One afternoon I found something odd tucked behind the bushes near my garden wall. A plastic pipe, old, brittle, nearly camouflaged in the dirt. It wasn't connected to anything anymore, but it had once clearly led toward the neighbor's side. It was the final clue. The smoking gun. Proof that I had been right all along. I held it in my hand for a moment, turning it over, then tossed it into the trash. Closure. Real closure doesn't come from revenge. It comes from knowing you were right. It comes from peace. And I had finally earned mine. It's strange how quiet victory can feel. You'd think revenge would come with fireworks, or at the very least, some triumphant music playing in the background while I walked through my garden like a queen surveying her reclaimed kingdom. But no. Instead there was only silence. And silence has a weight of its own. The old man was gone, his house sat empty, and my water bills finally dropped to what they should have been from the start. My pressure was consistent. My dogs had full bowls. My morning showers no longer started with that awkward trickle I'd grown used to. Life was calm. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered. Like the echo of his presence haunted the very pipes he'd tapped into. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe not. One evening I sat on the porch watching the sky fade from blue to charcoal. The street was quiet. A few kids down the block were playing with a ball, their laughter light and sharp. But my attention was fixed on the empty house next door. It looked darker than usual. Not just empty, abandoned again. Like it was trying to return to the way things had been before I arrived. For a brief moment, I wondered what would have happened if I had just ignored it all. If I had let him keep siphoning water. Maybe we could have coexisted quietly, me pretending not to notice, him pretending he wasn't doing it. But then I remembered how bold he had been. How he'd parked his bike in my garage on day one like the property was still public land. How he'd stomped up to my gate with fury when he realized someone had drawn a line. He had never intended to respect boundaries. He just hoped no one would enforce them. That realization burned away any lingering guilt. Still, it left a strange aftertaste. As people started talking. Neighbors who had once smiled politely began to glance at me a little longer than usual. A few older women clucked their tongues when I walked by. And though no one said anything directly, the message was there. In the stiffness of their greetings, the way their eyes flicked toward the empty house and then back to me. They didn't know what I'd done, not exactly. But they knew something had happened. I suppose stories travel faster than facts. And I'd made the mistake of winning quietly in a world where drama speaks louder than justice. One morning, I bumped into one of the other homeowners on the street. Mrs. Harani, an elderly widow with the sharpest eyes I'd ever seen. She always wore the same floral scarf and walked her cat like a dog, trailing behind on a leash like a shadow. She stopped me at the corner. "Strange, isn't it?" she said, peering at me with an unreadable smile. "How quickly things change when the right person moves into the wrong house." I blinked. "Sorry." She gestured toward the old man's place. He may have been a miser, but he was predictable. We knew what to expect. You are different." She didn't say it like a compliment. It wasn't quite an accusation either. Just an observation. I forced a polite laugh and moved on. But the words stuck. Different. Isn't that what I'd wanted? To shake up the status quo. To stop being seen as the girl with the dogs and the fixer-upper, and start being seen as someone not to be messed with? Apparently that came at a price. But I was fine paying it. Because the alternative was letting people walk all over me. And that I'd done enough of in the past. The truth is, I wasn't always this bold. I used to be the kind of person who apologized even when someone else bumped into me. I I kept my head down, tried not to cause waves. I grew up in a household where peace was valued more than justice, where we were told to let it go, even when something was deeply unfair. But life teaches you. And sometimes, life gives you the perfect metaphor in the shape of an old man stealing your water and daring you to stop him. He had underestimated me because I was new, because I was young, because I was a woman, maybe because I smiled too much, or maybe just because he thought the house would always be his for the taking. Whatever his reason, he made one fatal mistake. He forgot that still water runs deep, and that when you try to drink from someone else's well, you better be prepared for what's waiting at the bottom. Weeks passed, then months. The for sale sign outside his house remained. Eventually, the paint started to peel from the edges of the board. A bird built a nest on top of it. Nature, it seemed, was eager to reclaim the space before a buyer could. One day, I saw someone new walk through the gate. A man in a suit with a serious face and a clipboard. Another potential buyer, I assumed. But he didn't look at the structure. He spent more time circling the outside of the house, inspecting the walls, looking closely at the ground where the old piping had once run. He was here for the damage, not the dream. I didn't envy the realtor. How do you sell a haunted house without ghosts? Just a trail of bad decisions and the memory of a grudge that burned too quietly to make headlines. But I didn't look away. I stood tall on my side of the wall, water running, lights on, my dogs lounging in the sun. Because this was my house now. And no one, no man, no neighbor, no ghost, was ever going to take that from me again. By the time the house next door finally sold, I had forgotten what it felt like to live in someone else's shadow. Took nearly 6 months. 6 months of that crooked for sale sign. 6 months of strangers wandering through the yard, whispering to realtors while side-eyeing the property line. 6 months of hearing nothing from the old man who had once treated my home like his personal water park. The final buyer was a young couple, freshly married, enthusiastic, naive. They saw potential in the old house the same way I once had with mine. I watched them move in with boxes full of IKEA furniture and wedding gifts, grinning like they'd won the lottery. I didn't warn them. It wasn't my place. Besides, the house wasn't cursed. The man who cursed it had already been exorcised. Still, I kept my distance. Friendly but guarded. I waved when they waved. I answered their questions when they asked. But I no longer felt the need to overextend myself for my neighbors. I had learned that kindness without boundaries is an invitation to be taken advantage of. And I was done handing out invites. One Saturday morning, I sat on my porch with a mug of hot tea, watching the sunrise stretch across the rooftops. My dogs lazed at my feet, the air was cool, and the city hadn't fully woken up yet. For the first time since I'd moved in, I felt rooted. Not just a guest. Not just a woman trying to fix up a fixer-upper. I was home. And that feeling, that solid, unwavering certainty that I belonged here, that this land, this structure, this silence, it all answered to me, that was worth everything. Sometimes I think about the old man. I imagine him sitting in his daughter's house, complaining to anyone who'll listen, telling some distorted version of the story where he's the victim, and I'm the villain with a wrench and a vendetta. Maybe he says I tricked him. Maybe he says I sabotaged his system. Maybe, in his mind, he still thinks he had a right to what he took. But I don't care. Because truth doesn't need permission to exist. I don't need his confession or his apology to validate what I know. I saw what he did. I watched my own water pressure drop, heard his pump groan to life like a parasite leeching off my supply. I played his game until I didn't have to. And when the time came, I ended it. Clean, quiet, final. It wasn't just about the water, or the bills, or even the law. It was about the principle. About the way people look at women who move in alone. About the way entitlement wears a polite face and calls itself tradition. About the unspoken assumption that if something is unguarded, it's up for grabs. I was never going to change him. But I made damn sure he'd never pull the same stunt again. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But mine wasn't cold. It was calm, surgical, precise. And in the end, that made it all the more devastating. I didn't shout. I didn't break his property. I didn't threaten or expose him. I simply cut him off. Denied him access to the resource he never paid for. Let his own system collapse under the weight of his shortcuts. That's the thing about parasites. They only survive when the host stays silent. And I was done being silent. My home has changed since then. The cracks in the wall have been patched. The garden blooms now. The dogs run free without barking at ghosts. I even painted the old back gate, deep green with brass handles. Strong. Unshakable. Like me. People pass by and compliment the house now. Some don't even realize it was once seen as the abandoned place. It's not that anymore. It hasn't been for a long time. It's lived in. It's guarded. It's mine. And if there's one lesson I've carried from this experience, it's this. Never underestimate a woman with a wrench, a backbone, and a working shut-off valve. Because when she decides enough is enough, she won't burn down your house. She'll let it fall apart on its own and walk away without a single scratch. It started with a smell. Not a foul one. Not like rot or sewage. More to metallic. Faint but persistent. Like the air was carrying something it shouldn't have. For a few days I ignored it, assuming it was something from the street or construction nearby. But it clung to the breeze that moved through my hallway, especially in the mornings. On the fourth day I found the puddle. Just a small one. A shimmer of moisture near the base of the back wall, close to where the original water lines ran years ago. The same area where I had asked my plumber to check everything during the big purge. Tap this puddle was new. I knelt beside it, touched the edge with my fingers. Clean water. Pulled. My stomach clenched. It had been months since the old man moved out, and longer since I'd thought about his tangled mess of pipes and backdoor connections. I'd assumed we'd cut everything. I paid extra for a full inspection, full reroute, full shutdown. There shouldn't have been anything left. And yet here it was. A quiet leak. Coming from inside the wall. I called Ravi, my plumber, and had him over within the hour. He'd done all the original work and I trusted him more than anyone else when it came to my water system. He knocked gently like he knew something was off before I even opened the door. I checked this wall myself, he said, running his fingers along the damp base. But it looks like someone tapped into a line behind the concrete. Not where your main pipes run. I frowned. Behind the wall? As in a hidden? He nodded. It's old. Probably predates even your renovation. Could be a line the previous owners never even knew about. Or, his voice drifted. Or, I pressed. He gave me a look. The kind professionals give when they don't want to say what they're thinking but know you deserve to hear it. Or someone found it, knew it was still connected to the mains and used it. The implication hit me like a brick. Even after all this time. Even after the pump disaster. Even after the move, the fines, the shame, he may have come back. Or worse, he never really left. I remembered that quiet stretch of weeks after he'd moved in with his daughter. The silence. The uneventful days. I'd felt so secure. But I hadn't thought about one simple, critical fact. The man was a mechanic. A retired one, sure. But if anyone could have snuck into the side of my property in the dead of night and reconnected a hidden water line, it would be him. Ravi and I looked at each other. I want it ripped out, I said coldly. Every pipe inside this wall. Gone. We didn't wait until morning. That same evening, Ravi and his assistant began breaking down the inner layer of the back wall. It wasn't easy. Concrete, bricks, old metal mesh buried beneath outdated plaster. But when the dust cleared, we saw it. A single narrow pipe. Dull copper. Spliced awkwardly and patched in a way no professional would ever touch. It ran horizontally deep into the structure, and out. Where does that go? I asked, even though I already knew. Ravi's expression turned grim. Directly into the boundary wall. And from there, probably under the neighbor's garden bed. We followed it, carefully, quietly. Dug alongside the edge of my property where the old man used to plant bittergourd vines that had long since withered. The pipe continued. It was buried shallow, hidden beneath a loose row of bricks. Like someone meant for it to be found eventually, but not too soon. It led straight to a new spigot. In the garden bed of the neighboring house. Not the old man's house. The new one. The couple who had just moved in. My jaw clenched. No, I whispered. No, he wouldn't. But the evidence was right in front of me. A secret connection, buried just enough to avoid casual detection, running from my supply into their yard. He must have done it before he left. One last act of pettiness. A final insult. Maybe he thought the house would stay empty forever. Maybe he assumed the new owners would never know. Or worse, maybe he'd made a deal with them before he moved. Either way, someone had turned that tap. And someone had been drinking from my well. I didn't sleep that night. Not even a minute. The thought that someone had been drinking from my water again after everything, after the wreckage I'd left behind, the fines, the broken wiring, the burned-out pump, it made my blood boil. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a coincidence. It was deliberate. But the question clawing at the inside of my mind was even worse than the violation itself. Did they know? The new couple. The young pair with matching bicycles and matching coffee mugs. Were they innocent, unaware that a hidden pipe beneath their garden fed from the house next door? Or had they noticed the magically endless water pressure and chosen not to ask questions? There was only one way to find out. The next morning, I walked over to their gate with a small tin of cookies. The most basic, neighborly peace offering I could find. I kept my smile tight and my posture casual, though my fingers itched to point at the spigot like it was a murder weapon. "Hi," the woman greeted me. Emily, if I remembered right. Mid-20s. Bright eyes, perfectly styled hair that bounced when she walked. "Oh, you didn't have to bring anything." I handed her the tin. "Just wanted to say hi. It's been a few months since you moved in, but I figured I should officially welcome you." She beamed. "That's so sweet. We've been meaning to come by, but you always look so focused. Like you've got projects going nonstop." I laughed, softly, politely. That's one way to put it. We chatted about harmless things for a while. The weather. The local fruit market. Her dog. Some tiny breed with a bark like an old cell phone ringtone. All of it felt normal. But I couldn't shake the feeling under my skin. When the moment felt right, I gestured toward their backyard. "I noticed you guys added a new faucet by the fence. Handy, right?" Emily tilted her head. "Oh yeah. That was already there when we moved in. We just cleaned it up and replaced the nozzle. We've been using it to water the garden." I froze. Already there? Already there? She didn't say they installed it. She didn't say a plumber connected it. She said it was already there. I smiled. And I knew. They didn't know where it came from. They just saw a faucet, assumed it was part of their property, and started using it. And honestly, I didn't even blame them. That kind of assumption was exactly what the old man had counted on when he slithered away in disgrace. He'd built a trap. One that would keep leeching from me long after he was gone. And I was done being a target. That night I made a call. Not to the police, not yet. But to Ravi. "I want it cut," I said. "Not just disconnected. Ripped out. I want the entire line removed from under my soil. No trace. And I want a valve installed on the inside in case anything like this ever happens again." He didn't ask why. He just said he'd be there the next morning. When the work began, I didn't tell the neighbors. I wasn't ready to confront them. Not yet. I needed facts first. Proof. I needed to know how much they'd used, how long the line had been active. So I did something a little obsessive. I had Ravi install a tiny water flow monitor on the hidden pipe before we disconnected it completely. It would track the exact amount that passed through. I gave it one more week. And every day during that week I acted normal. Waved when they waved. Smiled when they smiled. But inside I was counting gallons. And when Ravi came back with the data, I had my answer. 436 liters. In 1 week. 400 liters of my water used through a line they claimed to know nothing about. That wasn't an accident. That wasn't watering a few flower pots. That was filling something. Maybe a small tank. Maybe a secondary system. But it was intentional use. So I knocked on their door. No cookies this time. Emily answered again, but this time I didn't let the fake smile stay on my face. "Hi," I said. We need to talk. About the faucet in your garden. Her eyes flicked with something, hesitation, guilt. I had it traced, I continued. It's connected to my supply line. And over the last week, it used nearly half a ton of water. Her lips parted, but no words came out. And behind her, her husband, Mark I think, appeared in the doorway. What's going on? He asked. I repeated myself. Precise. Then I waited. They looked at each other. And then he said the one thing I hadn't expected. I thought the agent said everything was hooked up. Silence. I blinked. The agent? I asked. He nodded. Yeah. The guy who sold us the house. He told us the garden faucet was an exterior backup line and not part of the municipal main. Said it wouldn't cost us anything. I stared at him. And slowly, everything snapped into place. The old man had told the agent. The agent had passed it to the new buyers. And the lie had lived on. He hadn't just left a pipe. He'd written it into the sale. I stood there in their doorway, the air thick with something worse than deception, denial. Mark still looked confused, but Emily had gone quiet. She'd folded her arms in that way people do when they feel a lie begin to unravel. Not with panic, but with preparation. Like she was already thinking 3 steps ahead. I took a breath. My voice calm but cold. You were told the garden line wouldn't cost you anything? Mark nodded slowly. That's what the agent said. That the faucet in the back was part of a private line, disconnected from the city main. I remember because I asked if we'd have to set up a second water account for it. And did you ever ask where that water came from? I asked. Silence. No, he admitted. We just assumed it was on a separate supply. Maybe some old well. I mean, this is an older house. Emily shifted behind him, still silent. Still watching me. But now I could see it clearly, she knew. Maybe not from day one, but she'd figured it out long before this conversation. And she hadn't stopped it. I tilted my head. And the agent who sold you the house, was he the same one who handled the listing after the old owner moved out? They exchanged a glance. I already knew the answer. Yes. The old man may have left the neighborhood, but he hadn't left quietly. He'd made sure to pass on his parasite line through the contract itself. A poisoned inheritance disguised as convenience. And now I was the one bleeding from it. But not anymore. I've already had the pipe located and cut, I said firmly. As of this morning, it's completely disconnected. You won't be getting a drop from my supply again. Mark lifted his hands, pacifying. Hey, look, if this is a mix-up, we'll get our own plumbing checked. We didn't mean to use anything that wasn't ours. Good, I replied, my voice sharp as a blade. Because here's the thing, I've tracked exactly how much you've used. I've got the data. And I've already spoken to a lawyer. That part wasn't entirely true. But it would be by the end of the day. I continued, unwavering. You owe me for the usage. And if you want to avoid this turning into something legal, you'll get your agent involved too. Because it sounds like you bought a lie. And if you're smart, you'll start chasing the man who sold it to you before I start chasing you. Mark's eyes widened. Emily's arms dropped. The atmosphere cracked. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Emily said something so softly I almost missed it. He said you were intense. I narrowed my eyes. Who? He swallowed. The agent. He said the previous owner warned him you were, confrontational. That you'd make trouble over little things. I let out a single humorless laugh. There was the old man's final poison. Even from a distance, even from exile, he tried to turn the neighborhood against me one last time. Painting me as the problem. The bitter woman. The one who couldn't let it go. But I didn't care. Because I was trouble, for people who thought they could steal and lie and rewrite the rules to suit themselves. I straightened my shoulders and met her eyes. I'm not intense. I'm just not someone you steal from. And with that, I walked away. The next 48 hours moved fast. I called my lawyer, who confirmed exactly what I thought. Even if the pipe wasn't intentionally used by the new owners, their property had been gaining from mine, which technically counted as unauthorized use. If it went to court, they'd lose. But I didn't want to go to court. I wanted acknowledgement, respect, a clean break. So I sent an official letter to their address, documented, signed, and stamped. It outlined everything: the illegal connection, the data from the water flow monitor, the dates and numbers. And at the end, it offered a choice: pay the small calculated cost of the water used, a symbolic amount, less than $20. Sign an agreement that confirms all lines have been disconnected and will not be tampered with again. Or refuse and face formal civil action. The next day they signed, paid in cash. No apology, no note, just a sealed envelope left in my mailbox. But that was enough. Because it wasn't about the money. It was about drawing a line, one they now understood would never be crossed again. The neighborhood shifted after that. Just slightly. Whispers faded. Stares softened. Even the passive-aggressive dog walkers started saying hello again. Why? Because now I was more than just the woman who'd bought the broken-down house on the corner. I was the one who'd cleaned it, fought for it, defended it, and won. I stood on my porch that evening, watering the plants in the golden light of dusk. My dogs curled nearby, lazy and content. The air was still, and the water, clear and strong, rushed from the hose with perfect pressure. Not stolen, not shared. For the first time in a long time, I felt like the war was truly over. The ghosts were gone. The pipes were clean. The walls were sealed. And I was free. Rain that night. The kind of rain that starts gentle, like whispers on the rooftop, then builds into a full symphony. I left the windows open just enough to let the scent of petrichor drift inside. The dogs were curled up in their usual spots, tails twitching as they dreamed, while I sat barefoot on the cold tile floor of the living room, a cup of chamomile tea warming my hands. I stared at the wall across from me, clean now, freshly painted. There was nothing left behind it. No hidden pipes. No stolen access. Nothing he could reach. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't bracing for the next problem. I wasn't checking for pressure drops or eyeing my neighbor's gardens suspiciously. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to fall. Everything was quiet. But it wasn't the kind of silence that comes with fear. It was earned. Like the silence after a long storm, when the ground has soaked in every drop and finally lets itself rest. There was a time I would have second-guessed every decision I made. Wondered if I'd gone too far. If I'd been harsh. If I could have handled it nicer. But not anymore. He taught me a lesson, that old man, though not the one he intended. He taught me that peace doesn't come from keeping things calm. It comes from setting boundaries so strong that no one dares cross them again. And when they do, you don't scream. You don't beg. You turn off the valve and let them drown in the consequences. I stood, stretched, and walked over to the sink. Turned the tap. Listened to the flow. Steady. Honest. In a world full of people who take without asking, there's something sacred about having control over even the smallest things. Like your own water. Like your own home. Like your own story. I sipped my tea, let the sound of the rain carry me into sleep. And in the morning, when the sun broke through the clouds and lit up the garden wall, there wasn't a single drop out of place.